Hello and welcome to the second video. So do remember this is going to be covering MTA, and this is a part of a 6-part course for learning Java for the MTA. In this video we're going to be understanding the basic method signature. So remember, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and make sure that you can remember 5 key points from this video. In the last video we looked at the main method. In this one we're going to be focusing on that signature for the main method. So each part of that signature tells us some information. The modifier, the return type, the method name, and the parameter list all tells us something. So the modifier tells us where we can access that method, how we can, or where we can access it from. The return type tells us if we run this code, what will be returned to us. The parameter list tells us that when we call this method, what values do we need to give it. Lastly, there's one more thing that we have to remember in this, and that's static. So static tells us we don't need to create a class before we call it. We can call it directly. So a lot of this is new words, but you need to try and remember those 5 important things. So let's have a look at some code. So this is the code. Which one's the modular? Which one's the return type? What is the name of the method? And what values do you think it expects? Okay, so the modifier is the public here. And you can see that even when making a class, we still need to add a modifier there. What do you think this tells us? Well, public, it means it can be accessed almost everywhere in the code, or it can be accessed everywhere. You have other modifiers, which we'll be learning in the next video, but it's just important to know that the first value here just tells you where you can access this information. Which one is the return type? Well, this one's a little bit difficult because in the main one we have this static thing. We have this static keyword, but we don't need to worry about that for now. We're going to be doing that in the next slide. The return type is void, and what void tells you is actually there's nothing going to be returned. So you can see in the code we don't see a return keyword. So we say void here, and this tells us and the computer that nothing will be expected nothing will be expected to return once we execute this. What is the name of the method? Well, the name of the method is main. If you change that, you can change that to almost anything you want, and that will be the name of that method. And what values do we expect? This is a little bit more of a tricky one. So we see this is a string, so it's saying that it's expecting a string, but because of the arguments here, args, it's saying that it will accept multiple arguments or none. So it's not actually expecting anything. However, if we change this just to string, and I'm sorry for the writing here, but if we changed it to string and then x, like that, what's going to happen is expecting a string into it, and then whatever is put into that method will be stored in this variable x. So this here at the end, this tells us what data we're expecting so we can use in our method. So that last model, that last code was actually quite some easy code there. What I've done now is I've made something a little bit more complex, and I made questions a little bit harder. So what I would like you to do is stop the video and see if you can answer those questions. Okay, so hopefully you've stopped the video. Let's have a look. So how many methods are there in that code? Well, if we look here, this is method 1. It actually gives you a bit of a hint here because we've got 2 boxes, and it actually tells you the 2 methods. So we've got one method here and the second method here. The first method is called main because we've got the main there. The second method is called number. What are the modifiers for the method? Well, we've got 2 public modifiers. What does that mean? Well, that means that we can access that anywhere in the code. So we can call that anywhere. What is the return type? Well, the first one, if you look here, the first one, void, this is the return type, which means we're not expecting anything back. Here we can see that it's returning something. Well, what kind of things does it expect to return? Well, it wants to return that integer, which means numbers. Don't worry about this too much because we're going to be talking a little bit more about the different return types, values in the next video. What do we think the void return type tells us about the method? Well, we've already mentioned this. It means that it's not expecting anything to be returned. So if we look at this one, this is expecting a value, and we can see the return keyword. In this method, remember between the two brackets here, it's not expecting anything to be returned. There is no return keyword. What do you think static means? Well, in this one here, do remember that main is called at the starting point. So this code will be executed straight away. However, we are trying to call this code down here. We want to try and call this code. However, this class and this code hasn't been created yet. So what we'll have to do in this one is we're saying, look, we need to create this class first, and then once we create this class and we store this in X, we're going to call this method towards this class. However, in the main, because we've added static, we don't need to create that class. So remember, static allows us to call methods without creating that class. Again, we kind of answered 5 and 6 together. So how do we change the code so that we didn't have to create the apt object? Well, all we could do if we wanted to change the code, we could have just added static into the second method. And if we'd done that, we could have just executed this code directly without creating the class. However, it's not a great practice to do this because if you're doing this again and again, it's easier for you to make mistakes. The last thing that I want to talk about, and I didn't ask any questions, is you can see here, this method is expecting 2 values. And so when we call this method, we must have 2 values here, and those values are 2 integers. If we don't have 2 values, or they're not numbers, there'll be an error. So we've learned quite a lot today about method signatures and what it can tell us. We've also gone a little bit more into seeing how code can link up. So we've learned a lot today. However, the main points that I hope you can take away and you can answer these questions are, do you know what the method signature tells us? Can you remember those things? What about the keywords from the video? So using those keywords, can you read a signature, a method signature, and get some information that that code's trying to tell us? And lastly, if you wanted to call a method that isn't static, what would you need to do? So can you remember how to create and then call a method? So if you can answer any of these questions, please leave some comments below. If you're interested in learning more from me, please subscribe or like the video. And then I'll see you next week. Goodbye.